Waterbenders can freeze a wave solid in less than a second, and then they can remelt that same ice and throw it back as a liquid. But why can they not go in the opposite direction? Why can they boil water when they can freeze it? This is one of those things that you never really notice until you notice, and then you can't unnotice. So today we're going to dive into the actual physics reason why this can't happen and why it's extremely hard for waterbenders, possibly on the same level as lava bending for earthbenders, blue fire for firebenders, and turning oxygen into liquid for airbenders. So hit that subscribe button and let's break it down. In the Avatar series, freezing is everywhere. Katara freezes Zuko in the Northern Water Tribe, she freezes the ocean under her feet to make a platform, and Hama pulls moisture straight out of the air in the middle of a Fire Nation forest. For waterbenders, the technique of phase change is very easy, at least in one direction. Just look at the fight between Paku and Katara. He manages to transition seamlessly and smoothly between water and ice at a moment's notice. But if we look to the heat side of the phase change scale, it's completely empty. Across both of the two shows, Korra and Avatar The Last Airbender, and the comics and the novels, there is not a single waterbender who heats their own water. The closest anyone gets is Katara bending fog and mist, but that already exists and that is not really a temperature change. And if you really look carefully at the series, the Fire Nation clearly knew about this imbalance between the phase changes of the waterbenders, because they built their highest security prison in the middle of a boiling lake. Think about what that means. If waterbending scaled cleanly with temperature, the boiling rock would be the worst prison site on the planet, since any waterbender who was dropped off there would have an ocean of ammunition around them. So that tells us one more clue, that once water is hot, waterbenders can't pull it back to being cold, at least very easily. Alright, so let's actually run the numbers on both operations, going forward into heat and backwards into coldness. Everything in these calculations will be for 1 kilogram of water, which is 1 liter, so roughly a big drink bottle. Let's start with freezing. Water takes 4.19 kilojoules to shift 1 kilogram by 1 degree. So cooling a liter of room temperature down to 0 costs about 84 kilojoules. And then you pay for the phase change itself, because for the actual molecules to stop sliding and lock into a grid, that costs way more kilojoules. In fact, that extra phase change costs an extra 334 kilojoules on top of the heating that we already went over, which was 84. So if you combine those, Katara's wall of ice comes at roughly 418 kilojoules expended through her body. Now, let's run the same liter the other way. Heating it from room temperature to 100 degrees costs 334 kilojoules, which is way more already. Because remember, that is just for the heating phase before we even get to the phase change of turning it into a gas, which is steam. When you include that phase change, and vaporizing all of that water into steam costs a whopping additional 2,257 kilojoules. That's a total of 2,592 kilojoules for steam against a mere 418 for ice. This makes vapor, or turning it into any type of hot steam, 6 times the energy bill of making an ice wall out of the same amount of water. And the phase change just on its own is nearly 7 times more expensive. And that gives us the answer right there. It just costs way more energy to heat things up than to cool them down. Now, those kilojoule numbers sound very low. People eat that in a single meal, easily. But that is only for 1 kilo of water. When we see Katara bending water, it's very often much more water. If you look at the massive ice wall in the Siege of the North episode, that is easily many liters of water, over 100 probably. And that is just so much energy. You have to times that by the 418 kilojoules pulled out of the system. Now, if she were to turn all of that into steam, that is 7 times more. And that's your answer. Katara was already tired after using the ice. So if she had to expend 6 to 7 times more energy, it just is not possible. It's way too fatiguing for the user. So this actually unlocks a very interesting piece of information and lore about the subbending techniques of lava, blue fire, and now steam bending. So we know in the shows that these techniques are exceedingly rare. Bolin is very lucky to become a lava bender. Azula is the only person in the known universe to bend blue fire during her time, and nobody at all bends steam. So this actually tells us a very interesting fact, that the genetic ability to do these techniques like lava bending and the others I mentioned actually come from the ability to expend less energy when heating up elements. For example, if someone were to be born with a genetic mutation that allowed them to expend only 100 kilojoules when heating up water into steam, that would allow them to become a steam bender. The same goes for lava. Bolin probably has a genetic mutation or some type of other ability, maybe it comes from the spiritual side rather than the genetic side, but something that allows him to expend way less energy when bending earth and turning it into such hot rock. And again, we go straight back to the energy figures, because lava bending is definitely not as rare as steam bending or as blue fire. So clearly it's much easier, and if we look at the numbers for that, that tells us the same picture. Rock takes roughly 0.9 kilojoules per kilogram per degree and has to climb about 1180 degrees before it starts to flow as lava. So that's around 1060 kilojoules of heating, plus another 400 to break the crystal structure. Call it 1450 kilojoules per kilogram. So you can see that it's much lower than steam, but it's still within the reach of many more people. And that is exactly why lava bending is way more common than steam bending, which we never see. But a question you might be thinking is, well, why don't they just get the water up to 99 degrees and then scold people with that hot water? Because then you don't have to pay the energy costs for the phase change and you pay way less and you get a pretty effective deadly weapon. Well, the answer to that is probably a bit more from the spiritual realm rather than the scientific realm. It's most likely that waterbenders are not directly controlling the temperature, like degree by degree. They're probably mostly controlling the actual phase changes themselves. They know the technique to create ice, but they're not really controlling the temperatures in between. Also, it could be more of a cultural thing on top of that, because we know in Avatar from the series Bible that the seasons, the events, the cosmological events, like the comet, all of these things affect the temperament and the bending of an elemental user. For example, during spring, earth bending is actually significantly boosted, kind of like the comet, but nowhere near as strong. This lets earthbenders do techniques that they usually can't do. It lets them have more precise control and have much harder hits. A similar thing very well could be the case for water. Maybe waterbenders can only heat up their water during the season of winter, because winter is the season that aligns with waterbenders. Maybe it also takes a full moon. All of these things could come together for why waterbenders just simply, first of all, don't have enough energy to heat up water like that. But even if they had the energy, like they had the genetic mutation, maybe they simply don't have the control over the element unless there's a full moon or unless it's during winter for them to be able to do it. And it could also be just from the temperament. We know that Zuko, when he lost his purpose and he was fueling his fire with anger, he could no longer bend really at all. Like, those puffs were pathetic, just like Zuko himself said. So maybe most waterbenders just simply aren't as in tune with the source of their waterbending being the moon as they should be to be able to bend those extremely hard techniques. Now, we have to talk about airbending, because this is where the idea gets genuinely brutal. The cooling side is very reasonable. Liquefying a kilogram of air costs about 415 kilojoules. That's not too bad. It's pretty much identical to a liter of water, so the energy is not the obstacle. What is though is the temperature. An airbender has to drop the gas by more than 200 degrees to even have a hope of turning it into liquid. That is just so much more energy, and it's way beyond human control, at least as far as we can see from the Avatar world. And then the heating side of air is worse than everything else in the video combined. To push air up a phase, you pretty much have to go to plasma, the fourth state of matter, and the energy required to strip the electrons off the nitrogen runs into the order of 100,000 kilojoules per kilogram. That is roughly 40 times the cost of steam, which was already 6 times the cost of going to ice. Basically, this is not happening in any way, shape or form from any airbender, even an avatar in the avatar state. So unfortunately, there will be no lightning bending coming from the airbenders. That is strictly the domain of chi and of internal energy of the firebenders. And the reason they can do that is because firebenders are the only elemental benders handling the energy itself rather than the matter. This makes them the missing half of every other element's equation. A waterbender cannot supply all that energy, and a firebender does nothing more but move energy around every day. If you look to the episode The Avatar and the Fire Lord, Sozin stops a wall of oncoming lava, but he doesn't throw flame at it. He grabs the thermal energy straight out of the molten rock. He siphons it and then vents the heat from his other hand, and the lava hardens into stone right in front of him. Iroh redirecting lightning is the same principle, moving raw energy through his body without absorbing it. And this is why firebenders can create lightning, because they are playing with pure energy. They can deal with pure energy and don't have to deal directly with the element itself if they don't want to. So that is why waterbenders can freeze water but can't boil it. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoy these elemental breakdowns, hit the subscribe button. There'll be plenty more. If you made it this far, drop a thank Mr. Zuko in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next one.